In 1889, under a blood-red Texas sky, a man once hailed as a hero stood alone in the dust, staring down the barrel of a gun held by his own brother. The air trembled with silence, the kind that comes before thunder, or death. And when the shot finally rang out, the West itself seemed to hold its breath. But what led to that final showdown, and what happened after, is a story buried deep beneath the myths of the Wild West. A story of betrayal, redemption, and the price of doing what's right when everyone else has lost their way. They called him Sheriff Colt McGraw, the lawman who brought justice to Devil's Creek, a town so wild, even the crows flew around it in pairs. But few knew the truth about how the sheriff lost his soul before he ever lost his badge. Because in the West, heroes weren't born. They were forged, in blood, greed, and guilt. And Colt McGraw's legend? It wasn't written in gold. It was written in gunpowder and regret. Devil's Creek wasn't always the kind of town that smelled like whiskey and gun smoke. Once, it had promise, gold in the hills, cattle on the plains, and a railroad on the way. But greed rides faster than progress in the frontier. By the time Colt McGraw rode in, the town was hanging by a thread, and that thread was soaked in blood. McGraw had once been an outlaw himself. Folks whispered about the Red Hand Gang, a band of riders who robbed banks by daylight and vanished by nightfall. But something broke inside Colt the night he shot a preacher by mistake, thinking he was a bounty hunter. From that night on, he swore off crime, pinned a badge to his chest, and turned his back on his past. At least, that's the story the papers told. When he arrived in Devil's Creek, the people saw salvation in his scarred face and steely eyes. He carried his revolver low on the hip, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. His voice was gravel, his stare was judgment. But under the badge, guilt still burned. He wasn't chasing justice. He was chasing forgiveness. The town had its share of devils. The biggest of them all was Eli McGraw, Colt's younger brother. Eli had the charm of a snake and the smile of a saint. He'd made a fortune running liquor, taking bribes, and shaking down the railroad men. The McGraw brothers hadn't spoken in 6 years, not since that night in Santa Fe when Eli turned his gun on their own father during a deal gone bad. But when word spread that Eli had come to Devil's Creek, and was running the town saloon, Colt knew the past had finally caught up with him. The first time they faced each other again, the air was heavy enough to cut. Colt stepped into the saloon, boots thudding against the warped wood, the piano falling silent mid-note. Eli looked up from behind the bar, a whiskey glass in hand, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Well," Eli drawled, "if it ain't the preacher killer himself. Didn't think the law would wear your face, brother." Colt didn't flinch. "Times change," he said. "Men don't." That was the beginning of the end. Over the next months, the town split in two, half loyal to the sheriff, half to the outlaw who bought their drinks and their silence. Colt tried to hold order with the little authority he had, but Eli held the real power, gold, guns, and the loyalty of men too scared to stand for anything else. Then came the train deal. The railroad company offered to pay Devil's Creek handsomely if they could build a stop through town, but only if the law could keep peace for 30 days. 30 days without bloodshed, and Devil's Creek would be reborn. Colt saw his chance at redemption. Eli saw his chance at control. Behind closed doors, Eli offered Colt a deal: let the saloon run, turn a blind eye to the gambling and liquor, and he'd guarantee peace. Colt refused. "I ain't making peace with the devil," he said. To which Eli replied, "Then you better start praying, brother. Because out here, God stopped listening a long time ago." The tension cracked like dry timber. Colt's deputies began disappearing one by one, a few quit, a few vanished in the desert. The people who once cheered his name now crossed the street to avoid his shadow. Every night, the saloon grew louder, and every morning, another man turned up beaten or dead. Still, Colt held on. He believed if he could hold the line, just long enough, Devil's Creek could still be saved. Then came the night of the fire. It started in the saloon, or maybe it was started by the saloon. Flames tore through the main street like Judgment Day. People ran screaming, horses bolted, and in the chaos, someone shot the deputy dead in the middle of the street. Colt dragged him into the dirt, cradling the dying man in his arms as the fire painted the sky orange. The deputy's last words cut through the roar of the flames. "It wasn't Eli, it was you they were after." By dawn, half the town was ash. The railroad men pulled their deal. Devil's Creek was done. And Colt McGraw was no longer a sheriff. 3 days later, he rode out of town, following the trail of his brother's men. He found them at dawn by a canyon's edge, the McGraw boys, face to face again, surrounded by the ghosts of what they'd become. Eli stood calm, coat flapping in the wind, his revolver already drawn. "You always did love being the hero," he said. "But tell me, who made you judge, jury, and executioner?" Colt's voice was low. "You did, Eli. The day you stopped being my brother." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, one gunshot. Just one. The dust settled, and Eli McGraw lay dying beneath the crimson light of dawn. Colt dropped to his knees, holding his brother's head as the blood seeped into the sand. Eli's voice was faint, but his words cut like knives. "You think you're different, don't you? You think killing me makes you clean?" Colt looked down, tears carving lines through the dirt on his face. "No," he whispered. "But it stops the bleeding." They say Colt McGraw vanished after that morning. Some claim he rode into the desert and never came back. Others say he wandered from town to town, a ghost in a tattered coat, saving strangers to atone for sins that couldn't be undone. But in Devil's Creek, they remember. Every now and then, when the sun sets just right and the wind rolls through the canyon, folks swear they can hear the echo of that gunshot, the one that ended 2 lives and saved none. Because the West wasn't built on heroes or villains. It was built on men like Colt McGraw, too good to be evil, too flawed to be saints. Men who carried their guilt like a badge, and their hope like a bullet in the chamber. And maybe that's the real lesson the frontier left behind. That sometimes redemption doesn't come in life, but in the story you leave behind. A story whispered around campfires, carried on the wind. And remembered long after your name fades from the map.